My name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 52. We are joined today by our returning co-host from episode number 21, which, if you're counting or scoring at home, which you should be, is our most downloaded episode of the first year of our August podcast. There we covered A Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. So I would like to welcome back to the podcast from episode 21, John Hill, aka Small Mountain. How you doing, John?
Dude, I am stoked to be back. I had a blast last time. I couldn't wait to share it with all my martial arts buddies. And I'm excited to dig into this because I think there's as much greatness in this as there is in the Five Rings. So, yeah.
Well, we are going to cover a whole plethora of topics today. We're going to talk about chivalry and knighthood. We're going to talk about competency and leadership, the need to be polite, and cover a number of other different areas in our book today by Inazo Nitobe, The Way of the Samurai. Now, I have a paperback version. John's got the hardcover version. My version came through or was published in 2022 by Arcturus Publishing Limited out of London, out of Arcturus Holdings Limited. However, this book was originally published in 1900. And so we're going to kind of go through this step by step. And if you listen to episode 21, you know that was one of our longest episodes, our longest conversations. It came in at around 4 hours and 15 minutes. If you have an opportunity to go listen to that, you should go listen to that, or you should go watch the YouTube video of that. And it's still, like I said, our most downloaded episode. And I'm hoping that The Way of the Samurai today will join that episode. And so opening from The Way of the Samurai, we're going to go to the chapter, again, if you are paying attention, on chapter 6. That's where we're going to start, on politeness. And I quote from Inazo Nitobe. When propriety was elevated to the sine qua non of social intercourse, it was only to be expected that an elaborate system of etiquette should come into vogue to train youth in correct social behavior. How one must bow when accosting others, how he must walk and sit, were taught and learned with utmost care. Table manners grew to be a science. Tea serving and drinking were raised to a ceremony. A man of education is, of course, expected to be master of all these. I have heard slighting remarks made by Europeans upon our elaborate discipline of politeness. It has been criticized as absorbing too much of our thought and insofar a folly to observe strict obedience to it. I admit that there may be unnecessary niceties in ceremonious etiquette, but whether it partakes as much folly as the adherence to ever-changing fashions of the West is a question not very clear to my mind. Even fashions I do not consider solely as freaks of vanity. On the contrary, I look upon these as a ceaseless search for the human mind for the beautiful. Much less do I consider elaborate ceremony as altogether trivial, for it denotes the result of long observation as to the most appropriate method of achieving a certain result. If there is anything to do, there is certainly a best way to do it, and the best way is both the most economical and the most graceful. Mr. Spencer defines grace as the most economical manner of motion. The tea ceremony presents certain definite ways of manipulating a bowl, a spoon, a napkin, etc. To a novice, it looks tedious, but one soon discovers that the way prescribed is, after all, the most saving of time and labor. In other words, the most economical use of force. Hence, according to Spencer's dictum, the most graceful. I have said that etiquette was elaborated into the finest niceties, so much so that different schools advocating different systems came into existence, but they all united in the ultimate essential, and this was put by a great exponent of the best-known school of etiquette, the Ogasawara, in the following terms. The end of all etiquette is to so cultivate your mind that even when you are quietly seated, not the roughest ruffian can dare make onset on your person. It means, in other words, that by constant exercise in correct manners, one brings all the parts and faculties of his body into perfect order and into such harmony with itself and its environment as to express the mastery of spirit over the flesh. What a new and deep significance the French word bienséance comes thus to contain. If the premise is true that gracefulness means economy of force, then it follows as a logical sequence that a constant practice of graceful deportment must bring with it a reserve and storage of force. Fine manners, therefore, mean power in repose. As an example of how the simplest thing can be made into an art and then become spiritual culture, I may take Cha no Yu, the tea ceremony. Tea sipping as a fine art? Why should it not be? In the children drawing pictures on the sand or in the savage carving on a rock was the promise of a Raphael or a Michelangelo. How much more is the drinking of a beverage, which began with the transcendental contemplation of a Hindu anchorite, entitled to develop into a handmaiden of religion and morality. That calmness of mind, that serenity of temper, that composure and quietness of demeanor, which are the first essentials of Cha no Yu, are without doubt the first conditions of right thinking and right feeling. The scrupulous cleanliness of the little room, shut off from sight and sound of the maddening crowd, is in itself conducive to direct one's thoughts from the world. The bare interior does not engross one's attention like the innumerable pictures and bric-a-brac of a Western parlor. The presence of kakemono calls our attention more to grace of design than to beauty of color. The utmost refinement of taste is the object aimed at, whereas anything like display is banished with religious horror. The very fact that it was invented by a contemplative recluse in a time when wars and the rumors of wars were incessant is well calculated to show that this institution was more than a pastime. Before entering the quiet precincts of the tea room, the company assembling to partake of the ceremony laid aside, together with their swords, the ferocity of the battlefield or the cares of government, there to find peace and friendship. Cha no Yu is more than a ceremony. It is a fine art. It is poetry with articulate gestures for rhythm. It is a modus operandi of soul discipline. Its greatest value lies in this last phase. Not infrequently, the other phases preponderated in the mind of its votaries, but that does not prove that its essence was not of a spiritual nature. Politeness will be a great acquisition if it does no more than impart grace to manners, but its function does not stop here. For propriety, springing as it does from motives of benevolence and modesty, and actuated by tender feelings toward the sensibilities of others, is ever a graceful expression of sympathy. Its requirement is that we should weep with those that weep and rejoice with those that rejoice. Why be polite? We live in a communication era with an A on the end of that, or error, R-O-R, at the end of the ER, depending upon your perspective. We live in a space in a time where the hot take matters more than the slow burn, where our Twitter feeds and who said what where on what social media platform, or who clapped back on who very quickly, seems to matter more than politeness. We can read these words from the Way of the Samurai and we can absorb them, but to actually practice them, to actually walk them out in our daily lives is quite honestly becoming more and more difficult. I picked this section to open and to have John and I talk about it because the samurai mindset, and that is one of the things that we are going to talk about today, how to adopt a samurai mindset. I'm not asking you to swing a sword or to go cut off somebody's head. I am asking you to adopt a mindset, adopt a way of thinking, a mode of behavior. And when we adopt a mode of behavior, we adopt modes of behaving. And one of those modes of behaving is politeness, even politeness in communication. A samurai mindset operates best, as was stated here when he was talking about the tea ceremony. It operates best within chaos, venality, disorder, and the conditions of spiritual battle, which I think we can all agree upon if we are operating with our eyes open anyway, that we are definitely in a spiritual battle, at least in the West, if not globally. And of course, some will say, such as it has always been, which is why politeness is something that we have always needed in our conduct and in our behavior. Metal is heavier than feathers, he says in a little piece there that I did not read. And that is an important thing to remember, because once attention to the parts of communication engagement have been abandoned, once the small things have been left behind on the road to the hot take, on the road to the quick and easy clap back, once those things have been left behind, we leave behind competency, and the rest, the whole thing is sure to follow. A building collapses once you remove the cornerstone from it. Why be polite? I want to thank John for coming on the podcast today. I want to open up the door to him, open up the floor to him. If he would like to reintroduce himself, he can. But let's start off with this question for you today, John. And once again, thank you for coming back on. I can't wait to sort of rip this book apart and start talking about it and applying it to leadership. Why is it important for leaders to hold on to politeness in a world where rudeness seems to be linked inextricably to this idea of not libertarian freedom, but almost libertine freedom?
So this is probably the chapter I have the least notes and highlights in, right? The other one being the chapter on like women.
Mm-hmm.
But as we're talking about this, I'm a sales coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so well known is the stigma of the salesperson, right?
Yep.
Be anything, say anything, do anything to get your money away from you, right?
Yep.
And to me, when he's talking about the stuff at the top of this thing, he's talking about the tea ceremony very specifically. I don't see that as much politeness as I think about it as being very intentional, like being very present, right?
Okay.
And I'm thinking about this all the time because, there are so many things that try to attract my attention, right? They try to attract all my clients' attention and stuff like this. There's always a fire to put out. There's always someone who wants your attention or to try to sell you something. And so the idea that you can go into a space and just enjoy the tea, right? You can put everything else aside and just enjoy the tea is huge, right? Because I think that more people should cultivate silence and disconnecting from social media and all these platforms that are pulling for our attention, and make it super easy to kind of, I call them keyboard commandos, right? These people who would never say these things in person, but because they're behind a keyboard and there's a certain level of anonymity, anything around politeness just goes out the window, and that drives me crazy, right? Because being an entrepreneur, growing a business, right? One of the things that everyone talks about is go be polarizing, because it's a great way to get people over to your side. I don't want to do that in my marketing message. I don't go about it that way, and I think the reason that we're here to talk about is like, how does this apply to leadership? Well, I think that right now, right, there's a whole bunch of organizations that are back in the office. Some people are still doing remote. There's a bunch of stuff in between around hybrid and everything. And there's all this electronic communication that leaves so much room to be misinterpreted. I've lost deals because I've done a follow-up and they injected the wrong tone. And because it was in the written word and not in a vocal communication where I can control the tone, they have the ability to turn it into a reason to like not move forward or something like this, and I think from a leadership perspective, we have to be more mindful around the idea that like everyone is busy. There is less focus, right? So that politeness is being present. My partner and I are trying very hard to like stop multitasking. So if we're working and we work together, and so she'll come in, she'll have a question for me. If I'm looking at my phone, she's like, I'm just going to wait. And now like I'm like, okay, and now it's forcing me to be more polite and just be more present in those conversations, which I need to be anyway. So the big takeaway from here is that with like Slack and email and so many ways to communicate, many of them are not appropriate for certain things, right? If you're trying to coach somebody, let's say that you're a sales leader, right? And it just hits your head that one of your reps had a deal, and you just send them a Slack message. Hey, when is that deal going to close? That's not a great conversation as a leader. You're putting your person back on their heels. They're going to respond to you with a fabricated response, and it might not be real or not. And like, there's no intention being put into this thing. It's just like, I got to get this out of my head. I got to move as quickly as I can because there's so much going on and I might forget about this. So for me, like, as I was reading this chapter, I was like, just like thinking about that idea, how much can get misinterpreted because it's written down versus said aloud. And as leaders, where are we falling down on that job of just assuming that people understand our tonality? Well, they know where I'm coming from, but they don't, because it might be 6 months between actual phone calls or meeting in person, doing this kind of like very close human interaction that really forms these bonds that we rely on when times are tough,
Is this, I'm thinking about multiple things and taking notes while you're talking.
Sure.
Because there's multiple sort of different threads that I want to play with a little bit here. And I think we want to move both up and down the hierarchy in this conversation. Obviously, we want to keep it grounded for leaders. And we want to be grounded in the space of the way of the samurai. We want to be grounded in what we're telling leaders, but we also want to, I always try to do this on the podcast, and we did this in our last conversation. Try to go up and down, right? Try to pull something down from the top, right? But also bring something up from the bottom, and try to get some synergy, right? Some uniting together, right? One of the spaces that's really interesting to me is the space of ethics and morals. That's really interesting to me. I took a whole class, an online class late last year, about ethics. And one of the core questions that came towards the end of it, that was listed as a practical sort of question to ask yourself, and I actually have it on my workstation here in front of my microphone. It's a little sticky note with 2 questions. Am I making the right ethical decision right now? And then am I doing the most ethical thing right now? And I keep it here as a reminder, not because I'm unethical or not because I need to be reminded of my ethics. I think I have an okay hold on that. Everybody's got cracks, and nobody's perfect. But I tie ethics to politeness, because I think that is one of the higher order virtues. And it disturbs me, as I think at a larger cultural level, particularly in our politics and in our culture, we've abandoned politeness in favor of rudeness disguised as being quote unquote real. Now, this is not new, right? I can remember before the internet, back in the 90s, the good old days, when people would say, I want to get real with you, or you need to show your real self, right? Or in the case of myself, coming off of Black History Month, I'd have other Black people ask me this: are you authentically Black? I never knew what the hell that meant. Oh yeah, we could talk about that. I never knew what the hell that meant. Now, by saying I don't know what it means, I'm rejecting the thing that I know it means. I'm putting it on notice, right? Because I do actually know what it means. But that's a form of rudeness. That's a form of impoliteness, right? And I think we've scaled that up with our social media usage, and with the ways in which we've allowed personalities, and I won't name any names because I don't need to. Everybody knows who the personalities are. We've allowed personalities to sort of tromp through our culture. I think that impacts leaders deeply. And I also think it impacts followers, because followers' expectations shift around, right?
Yeah.
It's not the person who you talked to who was the decision maker who turned down your deal, although they may have given the green light to say no or to say yes, for sure. It's the person who is 3 steps away from them that sent you the email.
Yeah.
It's the person in that chain that's missing that tonality. And weirdly enough, they're reflecting something from the leader's posture. They're reflecting something from the leader's unstated behaviors and communications.
One of the things that I was thinking about as we're going over this today, it didn't hit my radar whenever I was reading this the first time, but like talking about this today, is like I I think that politeness is tied to empathy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
I think Nitobe would agree, actually.
because I think if you, I'm a nerd, like I'm a big nerd. And I remember whenever I was first hitting this path of like really trying to be a sales professional, like really like embrace the craft and everything. And I went to go work for, or not work for a coach, but I went to go work with a coach. I hired a coach.
Mm-hmm.
It's my kind of default mode of like improvement, go find a coach.
Yeah.
And I was still going through there, like looking for tactics and looking for tricks and hacks and things like this. And it wasn't really until I sat down and somewhere along the way developed a whole lot of empathy around the idea that not every person who ghosts me on a call is malicious. He probably has some stuff to going on, because I have a bunch of stuff going on. Okay, cool. I can respect that. Okay. But I think until you go through it, right, or develop a practice of putting yourself in those shoes so that way you can be thoughtful about what they're going through, I don't think you can be polite, right? Which is why you have these people who just love to go around and say, hey, no offense, but insert offensive statement here, and it doesn't even need to be said the majority of the time. So where does this need come from, right? It just comes from this idea that like you think you know better, really, right? So you've not gone through the process, you don't actually know, and you don't have any empathy, and some people, like, I've heard this called empathy, I've heard it called EQ, I've heard it all these various labels, but nobody wants to like deal with the person who doesn't have any of that. That's why everyone hates their IT guy.
or hates Elon Musk.
So real quick, your sound changed pretty significantly, and you sound like you're underwater now.
How about now?
That's better. It's better.
That's better. Okay. I bumped my. Thank you. I bumped my.
It's still more than where it was when we started, but it's not as bad as it was.
It's not as bad as it was. Okay.
Yeah.
How about now?
That's better. Yeah. There you go. Okay.
There we go. All right. I had to readjust my mic. We're recording in real time, folks.
Absolutely. There is no editing.
There's no editing.
These are not hot takes. These are slow burns that we have put together and decided to share with everybody.
That's right. That's right. Is this a function of us becoming more atomized as a culture, though? Because here's how I see it. We had a glorious 20th century, and you don't get me wrong, there were problems. But both the more shall we say libertarian or libertine mode of being, more progressive, let's frame it that way, small p progressive mode of being, looked at the 20th century and said, we made cultural progress in changing our mores and changing the human heart in a Rousseauian sense. And we need to do more of that. And then a more conservative mindset, small c conservative, and I'm not talking political, it just means small c conservative, looked at the 20th century and said we had security and stability and a framework where too much openness wasn't prioritized, right? We had a sense that something was solid in the world. Even though you were bashing, even though a small p progressive may have been bashing up against that thing, it was solid, right? And so we came through a 20th century where the sense of stability, and by the way, Inazo Nitobe, we're going to talk about the literary life of Inazo Nitobe in a minute. He was a very much a merging of these two ideas together, right? If you look at his biography, and we will here in a bit, in merging those two ideas together in one man, that's what enabled him to write The Way of the Samurai, which has Western humanist elements to it. It has Buddhist elements to it. It has Christian elements to it. It has Hegelian elements to it. It's an amazing fusion of ideas. It's not fractal. It's not broken apart. Coming out of the 20th century, we live in a fractal time. We live in a time of atomization, of people having their desires and their wants atomized all the way down to the smallest possible part. And you know this in sales. You know, the more data you can get on somebody, the more you can specifically, narrowly sell to them. As a person who's passionate about marketing, marketers ruin everything.
Yep.
They ruin everything. And they ruin it because we want to sell, we want to tell more and more persuasive stories to more and more single individuals rather than the mass, because we can, right? And so of course we will. I'm not quite sure that atomization leads to empathy.
I think I agree with you, right? Because I think one of the things that I love is that there's a community for everything, right? If you're really into jujitsu, there's 1,000 communities for jujitsu. If it's guitar, if it's being an entrepreneur, if it's like whatever it is, you can go find your tribe, right? And this is how it's talked about out there. And I think you can get way too deep in any one of these things. And then there's a fine line between like a community and a cult.
Right. Yeah.
And so if you're trying to apply everything, like I'm a huge fan of metaphor. I use it constantly in coaching, but like sometimes the metaphor doesn't stretch, it doesn't fit, right? And it shouldn't be used in your decision-making process about does this, if this, then that kind of situation. So I think because we are so siloed, right? And there's so many communities and there's so many platforms and all of this stuff is just like constantly ongoing. I think if you're not very intentional with like seeking out balance, you're going to end up being a little bit of a feverish acolyte, no matter what community you're following.
Yeah. No matter what community you're in. Yeah. One other thought that came to me out of your series of thoughts there. Anonymity. The marketer Seth Godin pointed out something back in the halcyon days between MySpace and Facebook.
Way back in the day.
Way back in the halcyon day. When everybody skipped through the trees and Twitter was not even a dream yet, and no one really knew who Elon was, and Peter Thiel had just capped out of PayPal, and my gosh, Reid Hoffman and LinkedIn hadn't even happened yet. You know, the good old days.
The good old days.
that magical time in the early aughts, as they sometimes call it. He infamously wrote this in his blog, which, by the way, if you're not reading Seth Godin's blog, you probably should be. Even as a salesperson, you probably should be reading it. The philosophy that guy has is unbelievable. And he's just consistently been dripping it out over the course of the last now close to 35 years. Man's got a track record. Anyway, one of the points he made that has stuck with me about anonymity is this. He has said, no society has ever survived anonymity in communication.
Yep. It's funny. I'm a big fan of being like transparent, right? And so like all these different platforms that I'm on, I always try to show up as John Small Mountain, right? So like even when I'm gaming, my name in game is also Small Mountain, right? Because I like a little bit of pressure to act like an adult, to act with some civility, you know, in all these different situations, you know. And I think I've not heard that line before, but like that makes complete sense, right? If you take away the feedback loop, right, tied to like actual accountability, go look at Twitter. It's already off the rails. Like go look at any social media that doesn't require like an actual transparency to it. It's a mess.
And people will push back on this who like anonymity, and they will say, well, you need anonymity to call out powerful people so that you don't lose your position or you don't lose your livelihood. I've often heard this pushback. It's easy for people to talk about a lacking anonymity who are already financially protected from the results of not having it or being transparent, right? And I think that's a cop-out, quite frankly.
I agree.
And I'm going to say why this is a cop-out. I have and I've said this before on this podcast, I have 26,000 tweets, getting ready to be 28,000. I am sure that there's something objectionable, and at least I'm going to give a percentage, 15% of those tweets. Somebody someday over the course of the last 10 to 12 years will find something objectionable, either something I tweeted or retweeted. I'm not afraid of anybody finding anything objectionable in that 15% of tweets.
Yeah.
There's no fear there. Because see, here's the thing. If you're judging me by my Twitter feed and you're making a statement about my character or an assumption about my character, and you're anonymous on Twitter, but I'm not, and you can find me, I think I have the high ground.
Oh, I 100% agree. Like I have rules for who I connect with and who I network with, right? Because I'm always out looking for people, connecting. I'm a big networker. I run a community with 115 people in it, and I'm always looking to add people to that. So like I network all the time on social.
Yep.
And if you don't have your picture, like not your logo, because like I get that we're all in business, we're all trying to push our brands and everything else like this. But if you don't have a photo of yourself, no, can't do it. I don't even want to have a conversation with you because I don't know who you are.
Right. Well, I think it even now goes past pictures, because Facebook solved the real picture, real human being problem, kind of. Not totally, but kind of. I think where we're at now is words. We're at the shall I be biblical and Greek in this a little bit here? We're at the problem of the logos, because words bring into flowering reality. That's why we read books on this podcast, because we're not only bringing into flowering ideas, but we are also bringing into flowering avatars of reality, and we're putting those on, and we're allowing ourselves to walk around in that avatar and put ourselves in it, without risk, by the way, to us, because I can put down the way of the samurai and I can go off and live my life. Inazo Nitobe is passed away, and yet I exist. And I've written 3 books myself. When I pass away, the books will exist in one form or another, right? And so the magic of books is the ability to put the avatar on and take the avatar off and walk around in a mindset. As another guest of ours once said, way back in the beginning days of this podcast, books are paper leaders, right? And we put on their paper leadership and we walk around in it. And then, just like a child who puts on his father's shoes or her father's shoes, we get to take those shoes off and walk around in our own feet. It gives empathy. It gives understanding. It allows us to be anonymous, but not really. It allows us to take on a new identity. But when all words are coming from a space of anonymity, I'm not convinced that communication can survive that. That's when you really have the test of whether or not metal is heavier than feathers, I think, to push that metaphor.
I agree. Like I don't see myself going into a social platform not as me at this stage, right? And that's fine. Like I know lots of people and their Twitter is just for sports. That has nothing to do with their business. That's okay. That's totally fine. But to me, it's why hide, right? Like why not? And you talked about hot takes, and hot takes are like there for a while. I was trying to be the hot take guy, and I just realized, you know what? I don't want to be this guy, right? I don't want to just spout out the first instance of the first emotional thing that I think about after I read that Stripe is no longer going to waive, dispute fees, even if you win.
Right.
Well, yeah, that's garbage. Well, let's look at it from the business perspective. There's probably a good reason. Okay. And then I get to make a decision about whether or not I want to continue to work with Stripe. Right. So
exactly.
It doesn't take very much. And this goes back to like really what the chapter is about. It doesn't take any time at all to go be kind, to go be polite, to give someone the benefit of the doubt, right? Is how I think about it now. Because that benefit of the doubt, like I know some people who you go read their social stuff, you're going to think they're the most hard-edged, heavy-handed, person you could possibly imagine. But because I know them, I give them a little bit of grace, right? And he talks about grace in the book. And I just think it's really interesting because grace was like a very interesting word for me. Like it wasn't really a word that was in my vocabulary until I really started to like kind of focus on empathy and giving people the benefit of the doubt. And this is part of a bigger process of trying to walk back my jaded sensibilities about being in sales, right? Because, it's super easy to just start thinking that everyone has it out for you, right?
Right.
And it's not healthy. It's not it's not, you're not going to make it if that's your mindset,
Well, and the first take is probably no, not even the first take. I'll go even past that. The hot take is probably wrong.
Yep. Agreed.
The hot take about that person, the hot take about that idea, the hot take about that interaction. I've had several interactions over the course of just this week alone. And I'm not only reading this book, I'm reading like 4 other books too. So I've got a bunch of other different things like mushing around together in my head. I'm involved in a number of different projects that are offline in the real world, solving what I call real problems for real people. Because I'm getting more and more passionate about not being in the internet space and being out of the internet space, and doing some interesting things out there. And in the course of those interactions, the pause is the most powerful tool you have.
Yeah.
And it's either putting other people on pause or it's putting yourself on pause. So we were talking about before we came on, one of my fellow jiu-jitsu players who walks into the studio and, he's got a shirt on and it says something on. And, my first take may not be positive towards that. Yeah. That may not be correct, by the way. That may not be the correct take to have. Maybe the second take is better. Maybe the pause is correct. Now I've got an entire toolbox, a leadership toolbox, such as it were, of options as to how I communicate with that person. But if I'm just doing the Twitter thing in real life,
oh man,
I'm constantly on the edge all the time and I'm not getting anything accomplished, and other people find me to be grating and irritating.
Yeah. I think it took me a long time to get to the place to where, because I think about default modes a lot. Like, what is your automatic response, right? And being a Kung Fu guy, and being prior service military, I have a very definite vision of what I want my default response to be in certain situations, but now the thing that I'm really trying to do, and it's working, right? And this is kind of crazy for me to talk about with really close friends, is somewhere along the way, I became a silver lining optimist guy who gives people the benefit of the doubt.
I know.
And 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I had none of that, right? It was my way or you're wrong. And I can remember being in basic training and hearing a drill sergeant say that for the very first time, you're either doing it right, which is my way, or you're wrong. There's nothing in between. And I was like, finally, somebody gets it the way that I want to, I want this world to go this way. But, I think about people who make stupid decisions, and at a fundamental level, if those decisions don't match with mine, I want to take the idea of you're doing the wrong thing, but I can only come to that decision based upon my perception of why they're doing these things,
Yep.
And, what I try to do now as a coach is I try to ask, okay, why are you doing it that way? Right? Because if you have a reason, let's test. Let's see if this is the better way. I'm totally down to put some volume behind this, and then we can test our assumptions. Sample size is going to be a big thing, especially in selling. But why? Do you have an intention, or are you just winging it? Right? Intention's a really big thing for me, because I think as salespeople, we have to be very intentional with what we want to talk about, who are we trying to target and have conversations with, and what's happening in those conversations, right? The reason why salespeople have a bad name is because they get very excited, and then we have selective hearing, and you hear the things you want to hear. And until you work with someone like me who can show you, hey, you need to ask some additional questions around this thing because you're about to step in potentially a bear trap.
Right.
Until someone works with me and they understand, frequent situation, this looks amazing. Right. And then everyone's like, oh my God, we're going to close this deal. Hey, thank you so much for letting me know. What about this is so amazing? Because most people don't like this. And then you get to have a great conversation about what they like. And you know what? It means you're on the same page with them. You're going to miss less deals on the backside of it because you were very present, very intentional, and you were listening.
Presence, intentionality, mindfulness, politeness. This is a hierarchy of order, right? And it's I think it's all summed up in when he talks about the tea ceremony in this chapter, because that's, I'll admit, I don't much think about the tea ceremony. I just don't, like, it's not something that's really on my radar. And at the same time, now that it's on my radar, it bears looking at a little bit closer as a result of Mr. Nitobe's analysis of it and how it relates to the way of the samurai.
Okay, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this because I think about this probably more than I should, right? Intentionality and right place, right time, and different things like this. And I love the idea of a tea ceremony, but I also love the idea of sitting down and having like a really great bottle of, scotch, right? And I've got the big ice cube, and you hear that clink as you drop it in there. It is that whole process of setting up the experience that creates the greatness of the experience. I don't care if it's wine. I don't care if it's alcohol. I don't care if it's sex. It largely doesn't matter, right?
Right.
That warm up process puts you into that mindset, which is why I think too many people are kind of over bragging around their morning routines, right? I get up at 5 a.m. and I do 17 things before like anyone else all gets awake. Cool. That's great. But it's not for everybody. But, or I'm sorry, your warm up is not going to be the right thing for everybody. It can't be, right? But most people need a warm up of some sort. And the older we get, believe me, as a guy in my 40s, right? And I try to go do something without like properly stretching or warming up first, and then I'm miserable because I pulled something for like a couple of days later. Like those warm-ups are helpful, right?
We're actually moving towards weirdly enough, we're moving towards a family stretching routine. We're going to stretch together as a family.
Man, you're almost an Asian organization, right? You're going to force everyone to come in and line up in front of the house, like do all the stretches and calisthenics and movement exercises. Amazing.
Yeah, then we're going to break down an AK-47, and then we're going to send the kids off.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good time. Right? Your kids are already like expert level gymnasts, right? And horseback archers and everything. Yeah,
that's right. Oh my gosh. No, I agree. It doesn't necessarily have to be around tea. It can be around anything. I mean, it goes back to that again, what we said at the opening, this whole slow food movement, right? Like how are we taking things out of the chaotic, the venal, as I said, the how are we pulling meaning from disorder? One of the huge things about the last 20 years in the United States of America, and for my international listeners, you may not know this, but one of the huge things over the last 20 years in the United States of America is how big an uptick there has been in anxiety, in stress, and in mental health issues. And I'm not talking about kind of stuff that you see on social media. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about practically diagnosed upticks, right, in all of these spaces. Because when you have anxiety, you disintermediate, you disintegrate. You fall apart, you fall into your commensurate parts. Well, that is a decline into chaos. That's not a rising to a pinnacle. There's another book that I'm reading right now, which I won't say the name of it, but it's a book about art history. And the writer talks about the Apollonian and the Dionysian in art, right? And Dionysian, she calls the forces of cathartic nature, right? It's meaningless, and it's diffuse, and it's a maelstrom, and it's separated, and it's all together, and there's no lines, everything's mushed. And then the Apollonian comes out of that and makes things sharp, and makes things distinguishable, and makes things definitive. And it's weird because I've been thinking about this a lot, like in relation to sort of where's this podcast going to go in the next 3 to 5 years. Been thinking a lot about that. And, we definitely started out in sort of a mushy Dionysian mess. But as we go along, we're becoming more and more Apollonian in our focus. And by the way, this is not something I'm consciously thinking about. This is something that's just sort of happening, right? That energy that's just on this podcast alone is the same energy that you see in the tea ceremony. It's the same energy that you see in dropping a couple of ice cubes and having a great whiskey, right? And hanging out with your friends. It's the same energy that you see. You mentioned sex and all of the stuff that we do in order to engage intimately and sexually with our partners, right?
Mm-hmm.
The things we don't talk about. We're pulling something out of that Dionysian mess. We're pulling something out of it and we're making it sharp and clear and definitive. And people need that. People need that in order to have structure out of chaos. And Nitobe understood that. Speaking of Nitobe, let's talk a little bit about Inazo Nitobe. Let's sort of introduce you to this man. Back to the way of the samurai. From the introduction, Inazo Nitobe, 1862 to 1933. A distinguished agricultural economist, author, educator, diplomat, and statesman, Inazo Nitobe was born in Morioka in what is now the Iwata Prefecture. His father, Jujiro Nitobe, died when Inazo was only 5 years old, and in 1869, he moved to Tokyo to live with his adoptive uncle, Takatoshi Ota, to whom he dedicated the present book because he had taught him at an early age to, quote, revere the past and to admire the deeds of the samurai, unquote. In 1877, Inazo entered the Sapporo Agricultural College, now Hokkaido University, to study agriculture, a decision that was probably due to Emperor Meiji's wish that the Nitobe family continue with their development of the once barren land near present-day Towada. Sapporo had been founded the preceding year by William S. Clark, former president of the Massachusetts Agricultural College, and Clark's influence was such that some 30 or so students, including Inazo Nitobe, converted to Christianity. In 1883, Nitobe began studying English literature and economics at Tokyo University, but left within a year to continue his studies in the United States at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. While there, he became a member of the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, through whom he met his future wife, Mary Patterson Elkington. From Baltimore, he went to Hale University in Germany, where he gained a doctorate in agricultural economics and then returned briefly to Philadelphia to marry Mary Elkington before taking up an assistant professorship at Sapporo in 1891. Appointments to full professorships followed, first at Kyoto Imperial University and then at the law faculty at Tokyo Imperial University. And in 1918, he was appointed founding president of Tokyo Joshidai, Tokyo Women's University. In 1919, Nitobe attended the Paris Peace Conference and in the aftermath of World War I, joined with other reformed-minded Japanese in setting up the Japan Council of the Institute of Pacific Relations. In 1920, he moved to Geneva, Switzerland, to become one of the undersecretaries general of the newly established League of Nations. League of Nations was a precursor to the UN, which came out of World War II. He also became a founding director of the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, the precursor of UNESCO. On his retirement from the League of Nations, he returned to Japan and served in the House of Peers in the Japanese Imperial Parliament, where he spoke out against the increasing militarism of Japan. In 1933, he attended a conference of the Institute of Pacific Relations in Banff, Alberta. On his way home from the conference, he succumbed to pneumonia and died in hospital in Victoria, British Columbia, at the age of 71. The present book is perhaps the best known of Nitobe's written works, but he was such a prolific author that the Japanese edition of his complete works extends to 25 volumes, while his works in English and other Western languages, have been published as a 5-volume set. His lifelong goal to become a bridge across the Pacific is celebrated in several biographies, both in English and Japanese, and in 2 memorial gardens in Canada, one at the Royal Jubilee Hospital in Victoria, British Columbia, and the other at the University of British Columbia Botanical Garden and Center for Plant Research in Vancouver. With its tea house and stroll garden, the latter is considered to be one of the most authentic Japanese gardens in North America and one of the finest outside of Japan. The Nitobe Memorial Museum in Towada City, Japan, celebrates the life of Inazo Nitobe, as well as the lives of his father and grandfather, whose irrigation canals brought new life to the region. The museum's tribute to the Nitobe family's long samurai history includes a collection of armor and other military artifacts. Inazo Nitobe received recognition of a different kind when his portrait was featured on the 5,000 yen note from 1984 to 2004. And this is a quote from Inazo Nitobe. What is important is to try to develop insights and wisdom rather than mere knowledge, respect someone's character rather than his learning, and nurture men of character rather than mere talents. Revere the past and admire the deeds of the samurai. This was the driving force of Inazo Nitobe. This was the fuel in his engine, from the time he was a little boy until his death. His lifelong goal in becoming a bridge across the Pacific came during a time when the predominant drivers of interaction, at least at an international level, and he surely saw this in the circles he was running in, those drivers were isolationism. In an American context, America refused to join the League of Nations. We proclaimed that anything that happened between World War I and World War II was a European problem for European people to solve. So isolationism was driving it, as well as not racism. That's very specific and individualized. Racialism was more the driver. Racialism in Japan over the Chinese, racialism in China over the Japanese, racialism in Korea over everyone, racialism in America that came in the form of isolationism and, of course, Jim Crow, and, of course, racialism in Europe, not just Germany. Russia, by the way, was struggling with its own form of racialism during the interwar years between World War I and World War II, as the man of iron from Georgia, Joseph Stalin, was busy with his 5-year plan to make a better Soviet man. Oh, and woman. Nitobe, however, worked through all of these circles and saw all of these things happening during a time I'm sure he thought was chaotic. I'm sure he thought was a time of little hope. And instead of turning to despair, he threw himself into action. He threw himself into planting seeds. And with his background in agriculture, he knew something that farmers know that we industrialists and we post-industrialists have forgotten. He knew that you had to recognize and honor the natural rhythms of the earth in planting, sowing, and reaping, and that acknowledging those rhythms which operate in us today is important for success. There's so many things to glean from the life of Inazo Nitobe. And if you go to his Wikipedia article, it's actually kind of thin. You really got to go to the Japanese wiki to find out some information about him, and really go to some Japanese websites, and they honor him quite greatly. And it's interesting because of everything that happened after the war. Japan had to go back and have sort of a reckoning with men like Nitobe, who were against war and didn't think that that was going to be the solution to the problem. Laying out the life of Inazo Nitobe, John, what insights can leaders take from this man? I'll be honest, I had no idea how great he was until I actually started reading The Way of the Samurai and really started digging into him a little bit.
Same. I spent a lot more time learning about Chinese philosophy and martial arts stuff than I have Japanese stuff, because that's where my mother tongue is a Chinese art, right? As far as like Kung Fu goes.
Yep.
I really love this quote, right? It is important to try to develop insights and wisdom rather than mere knowledge, right?
Yes.
It has never been easier to do a Google search word that Google search in a way that it confirms your biases, and never challenge any conventions that you have or that you're holding. The thing that I think is really interesting around this is just how much travel he did.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, the man got around.
How much he purposefully sought out probably very uncomfortable situations, right? Being an Asian man here, right, during that time probably was difficult, you know. And I think there's the amount of effort and worldliness that he like brings to this discussion, right? And you mentioned this before, right? He's pulling concepts from, you know, his mother tongue, right, of Confucianism and everything else like this, but he's also talking about Greeks and like, you know, nobility and English feudalism and all of this stuff. And you have to give the man the benefit of the doubt that he's got some knowledge here, which is great because, you know, we have people who were like experts after watching or reading one blog post or watching one YouTube thing. They've never tried it, or they've never done it, but they're more than willing to kind of, you know, shots fired on a hot take about why something doesn't work, and you've never tried it. And that's exactly what he's speaking to at the end of this thing. You know? And I think the biggest lesson, and maybe this is kind of just timeliness, is go travel, go experience other cultures, like go do something outside of the norm. You know, I just got a pretty unique opportunity to go to Dubai, and it was my first time to go out of the US. And I went to a conference, and I think there was one other American in the entire conference. And I'm out there, I'm networking, you know, rubbing elbows, trying to get meetings, you know, and everyone was like, "Why are you here?" I was like, "Well, this is where the cool people hang out. I want to come hang out with the cool people," you know. And it was such like an eye-opening moment, you know. And everyone talks about this, you know, like after you go experience another culture for the first time, you feel a little bit more worldly, a little smaller, like, you know, maybe some of the things that you knew to be right weren't actually right, and you can see some of that stuff. I think everyone should travel, should go experience these things, because, you know, he wouldn't be talking about these things had he not gone through his experiences. You know, he wouldn't, and even if he did, no one would take him seriously, because he wouldn't be able to reference anything else that we could make sense of, right? Before we turned on the recording, we were both kind of like going on and on about how the metaphor of equating samurai to like chivalry and knights and squires and everything makes the rest of the book so much easier to read, and to, you know what, I can get a little bit behind that because of that metaphor that he starts with. We wouldn't be able to appreciate that if the man hadn't spent time learning all these different cultures and really understanding it, right?
He the only way that you actually begin to appreciate and see your own culture is when you leave it and have to look back at it through another culture's eyes. I fundamentally believe that. It is a tragedy that most Americans, well, I won't say most, many Americans don't have a passport, right? Now, I think COVID shook some people out of their ennui in ways that they had not expected. And I do believe fundamentally the Great American Migration is still on. I mean, we went from a period of time between, I would say, the early 90s to about the time of COVID, when the average number of people who actually moved out of their localities dropped precipitously. I mean, we actually moved more in the 1960s and 1970s for job opportunities, for family issues, to live in different places. I mean, immigration, inter-country integrational patterns were more robust in the 60s and 70s than they were at a time when we were at our height of technological progress. But it kind of makes sense, because if you're trapped in the phone, you don't think you need to go anywhere.
It's true. Yeah.
If you're talking to people on the internet from Australia, why do you need to go to Australia? I can talk to somebody on the internet from Australia. I don't need to see what's happening with somebody in Indiana, because I could just go read what the New York Times says is happening about something in Indiana, happening in Indiana. Except the weird thing is the local news has declined in America. We're not going to get into all that, but that's a massively apocryphal and apocalyptic thing that has happened in America. And so, you know, there's no connection to your own locality. Instead, there's this larger connection to something that's global, but we don't even really know what that means. Immanuel Kant was once asked, what does a man of the world look like? And he's like, I don't know what a citizen of the world look like. And Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, infamously said, I don't know what that looks like. I don't even know how to answer that question. And he's just sort of wandered over there the way Germans sometimes do. And this was a response or a pushback against the Rousseauian notion at the same time that about the same time Kant was around, that you could create this new man that would be a global man. Localities still matter. And and in a country that's the size of a continent, Americans, you got to get up and get after it. You got to go somewhere else, even if it's only moving from, Pittsburgh to Iowa. Go get on the move. But so I do think that's happening now. I think COVID again shook people out of their ennui. But the other thing that's happening is Nitobe as an avatar of a particular time existed during a period of transitional change, similar to the period of transitional change we are going through at a global level, global cultural level now. So you said you went to Dubai. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting because, quite frankly, the world is deglobalizing. There's a writer and a demographer and geographer that I follow. I've bought all 4 of his books. I read his stuff. I read his blog, listen to his podcast. A guy named Peter Jesan. By the way, those of you who are listening, you should check him out. The least hair on fire analysis of what's happening in the world today with absolutely no politics involved. It's kind of amazing, right? And that's why I buy into him. I don't buy all of his conclusions, but 80% of them are backed up by okay, I see the numbers. I see what you're talking about. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. And one of the points he makes is that since 1989, we've been in a process of deglobalization. We've been in a process of America ratcheting back, and other regions of the world stepping up and kind of being in a panic about America ratcheting back, but stepping into that vacuum. And you most recently see this in the deal that China made with Iran and Saudi Arabia to get oil, and we Americans had nothing to say about that. We're like, China, you go ahead, you have a good time, because we're actually going to be a net exporter of oil next year for the second or third time in our country's history. We don't. The cries of no blood for oil, it doesn't really work anymore because we just pump it out of our own ground. Now, we can argue about the environmental aspects of that and whether or not that could be clean or dirty and carbon and all that. But that process of deglobalization is already apace and has been going on for quite some time. Okay. I say all that to say this. Nitobe existed during a time of colonialization when the exact same chaos was happening, and the League of Nations was an early attempt to bring together the globe, was an early attempt to unite people together, which of course really didn't work well until the United States sat down with everybody at Bretton Woods in 1945 and said, in exchange for you having the biggest consumer market on the planet, which we had already been the biggest consumer market on the planet since the end of the Civil War, but in exchange for access to that without tariffs, you'll appreciate this as a sales guy, we will guard your supply chains and we will send our children to die in wars for you. How about that? And all the rest of the world was in shock, because usually what happened at the end of a war, like an apocalyptic war like World War II, was the victor came in and just dictated to everybody and said, we're going to put a base here, 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 and here. And if you behave in such a manner that irritates us, we'll come in and we'll smack you so hard that you'll never get up again. But America didn't do that. Again, we could argue about whether that was good, bad, or ugly, but it did create the environment, a post-war World War II environment that Nitobe, I think, would have appreciated, where Japan was able to literally build itself out of the ashes and start selling us cars that run forever, along with everything else. I think there's an insight there for leaders, because as we are moving into an area, I worry more of isolationism and because in deglobalization, you get isolationism, you get that pulling away, you get that separating. Mm-hmm. I worry that the temptation to stay home might be too great.
I feel that.
And that's a real concern for me for leaders.
This is slightly tangential.
Yeah,
maybe, but I'm curious, right? Because
I'm going on about globalization. So go ahead. Yeah.
So, and I can only really reference like the jokey version of this, right? That no
Sure.
one really wants to be part of like the Zoom happy hour and these forced interactions with your team and stuff like that. So
Right.
how does a leader, in your opinion,
Mhm.
do a good job of building the right culture with the right amount of balance between, hey, like we need to be together so that way we can be on the same page, right? But we also don't need, like, a business is not a family. And like
Right.
one of my biggest red flags is whenever I'm talking to a founder and they're like, yeah, we want to make the salesperson part of the family. Nah, can't go with you. That's a nightmare for everyone involved.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how do people do that right now
Yeah.
with hybrid environments, remote environments? Like my team, like I get a really cool opportunity working with my partner. It's amazing. We don't even work in the same room because she gets tired of hearing
Mhm.
my voice all day long, understandably so. But like everyone else is global. Like I
Right.
work with people all over the world, which is awesome, and I love it. And I remember the first time someone was mad at me that I was choosing to work with overseas contractors because in their opinion, US was number one. And
Right.
I was like, okay, based on what? Like,
Right.
help me understand where this is coming from, because these people that I'm working with are solid. They know their
Yeah.
stuff. They're capable of working. They're accountable. They can get everything done, and it's fine. And yeah, I'm curious. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a bifurcation happening right now. And it's a split that started in COVID, but it's just widened as time has gone on. And I don't think the two splits can be put back together. So pre-2020, only around 1 to 2% of the white collar workforce worked remotely.
Yep.
At the height of the pandemic, it was something like 60%. It was ridiculous.
Dang, I would honestly have pegged it higher than 60, honestly.
And you can go check my numbers, by the way, listeners. You can go check my numbers, but the last thing I saw was around 60%. But among blue collar workers or workers that could not do their job remotely, 100% of them still showed up.
Yeah.
That's the bifurcation. That's the split. So let me make this very real. If you're leading garbage men, they don't know what the problem is. They showed up to work every day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes they had to wear a mask, but most of the time, most of those guys,
yeah,
nobody cared about them.
Mm-hmm.
They just cared that the garbage went away. And by the way, interestingly enough, in your community, in my community during COVID, even though community I left, garbage still got picked up.
Yeah.
Kind of amazing, right? Not amazing. That's the bifurcation. That's the split. And so what you will see happening, I'm going to relate this to literature, is sort of a split like in H.G. Wells' Time Machine. And this is what I worry about, the Morlocks and the Eloi. You're a geek, you'll appreciate this. This is what I worry about. I worry that the Eloi are all the white collar folks that are working remotely and are getting talent from other places and are just sort of floating along on the surface, not appreciating what the Morlocks are doing underneath.
Man, I had this realization because like I was delivering mostly via Zoom, mostly digitally before COVID, right? So like my life didn't radically change during COVID. I had a big revenue swing, almost lost my business and had to figure out a bunch of stuff, but everyone was going through that whole thing. And then like I would see on social media, everyone complaining about masks and not having to wear them and wearing them and everything else like this. And fast forward a month or something like this, and then I'm going to go pick up food because things are kind of back opened up and stuff like that. So like I'm going to go pick up some food to bring it back to the house. And I just have this realization of like, whoa, I don't have to do this anymore. Because like I came up in retail environments, like I sold cell phones, and then I worked in a bank, and like those people are being called in, right? That they have to be there even if it doesn't make financial sense, right? From labor and revenue and all that other stuff. And like it wasn't even on my radar that like I was like a unique person, because I can work from home, and I already was, and my life didn't really change. And so when I was like guys, like masks like really aren't that bad. I don't have to wear one for 12 hours in a warehouse when it's, very, very hot, right? And the breathing conditions are already rough, so like it's just a very and kind of going back to like empathy and being polite and giving people the benefit of the doubt, like one of my favorite things to like think about now is whenever someone cuts me off, like my default mode was, what? Anger, right?
Yeah.
And you're a terrible person, you got to be complete garbage. And like, holy crap, one of my favorite takeaways on my like sales development path was I was at a sales conference and this guy gets on stage. His name's John Rosso. He's an amazing speaker. And he's in the Sandler Network, and he says this line: "We judge everyone else by their actions, but ourselves by our intentions."
Oh yeah.
And man, talk about right place, right time. When the teacher or when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. That line hit me like a ton of bricks, man, because at the time I was selling websites and I was like, man, these aren't expensive websites. We're cheaper than these other people. And you're an idiot if you don't want it. Like, you're dumb if you don't want us to come in and fix your website, kind of deal. Like, man, like now that I'm not in web, there's so many improvements I want to make on my website. Like it took us forever to get version 2 of our website out there because I was busy doing other stuff,
right.
And make no mistake, I'm getting all the outreach from everyone. Hey, I would love to fix your website for you. We're only $30 an hour. And I'm so it's just that I think about that line all the time. And then my voyage into like stoicism in the middle of COVID, like really reinforced all that stuff because, everything in my life kind of exists on some sort of line, right? I'm always, what's your favorite thing about that? What's the worst thing about it, right? And I'm a very big nerd about this stuff. I always try to put things on a line and process driven. That's just how I think about everything. And I don't have to have an opinion about everything.
Right.
Which was like a really kind of like oddly empowering moment of like, you know what? Like, I don't have to give a crap about that. Yeah. And now it shows up in the worst ways ever now, because I've done a fair amount of work to kind of build a moat around myself around like news and media and all this stuff, because I don't think it helps me. It just riles me up and I can't do anything with it.
Right.
And then there was some big thing going on. I don't remember exactly what it was. And a friend of mine was like, man, aren't you outraged? And I was like, I don't have an opinion. And they were like, how can you not have an opinion? And they were just so mad. And I was like, I have so many other things I need to have opinions about: my business, my family. Everything else. This thing that's going to happen with me or without me can't be the thing, and they're like, yeah, but you should be out there. You should be out there, like, speaking up, doing your thing or whatever. And I was like, my thing is building a business profitable enough that I can then influence change at that level.
And leading other people.
Yes.
In a way that actually role models the kind of leadership that we need to see in the world. And this is where we go. So the bifurcation I'm talking about is the same bifurcation that's happening in companies right now.
Yeah.
And it's happening at that microcosmic level. And the challenge that leaders have is exactly what you said. How do I focus on this thing here that's happening right now, that's going to impact these people right now? Mm-hmm. I've often said on the podcast, and there's always new listeners, so I'll say it again: no one that you are leading knows who the president of the United States is. Sorry, they just don't. I'm sorry, they just don't. And by the way, not that they wouldn't be able to find him on a 5x5 card and a bunch of other presidents. They probably would be able to do that. But for the most part, this is the secret. Most people don't know who the president is. Most people don't even know who the governor of their own state is.
Oh,
and they have zero clue who the mayor is. They don't know, because but you know who they do know? They know John. They know exactly who John is. They know Jesan. They know that guy or that woman. That's who they know. You're the avatar for leadership. And I've been trying to impress this upon leaders for the last 5 years. If you want to fix, quote unquote, the remote hybrid problem, or you want to try to figure out how do I unite this team, understand that you're the most important person to that team member.
Oh man.
That's number one. Number two, if the Zoom happy hours aren't working, if the Slack channel is overwhelming, if the email tool you picked isn't work, stop it. Stop having meetings that don't go anywhere. And actually, instead, here's what you probably need to be doing. If you have a fully remote team, and I've done this for years, if you have a fully remote team, have one meeting one time a week with them for an hour, and then let them go do their work.
Yep.
By the way, you know how much time you'll have that will all of a sudden be freed up to do other things?
The other 39 hours.
The other 39 hours, right? You'll all of a sudden have, oh my gosh, you'll be amazed at the amount of things you'll be able to accomplish. And by the way, you can scale that up to your team.
Yep.
Now, after a certain point, obviously, it gets to be too much to handle. I would say probably about 5 people, at which point you need to be telling those 5 people to go out and hire 2 other people, and they have meetings on their calendar for an hour with those 2 people twice a week. And that's it. That's how you scale that out. But the bravery that's required in doing that pushes back against the hierarchical structure that exists, but that now no longer serves us in a bifurcated world. Now, if you're hybrid, here's the bigger challenge for you as a leader. If you're in a hybrid situation where, let's say you're middle management, you're the much put upon middle manager. Those are my people, by the way. And you've got the executive who's been out on his boat since 2020, sending you emails about how you got to get everybody back in the office. Mm-hmm. And you've got the frontline people who you're monitoring via keystroke, but you can't justify your own managerial existence. Again, to paraphrase from Good Will Hunting, number 1, don't do that. Number 2, you should realize that you're getting paid $250,000 a year for a job that you could probably do the same from home for about 125.
Yeah.
That idea of uniting, or not uniting, justifying managerial existence is the part of the biggest challenge of hybrid. And if you'll note, most of the studies that are coming out about hybrid work talk about how hybrid impacts frontline workers and impacts executives. There's very little conversation, at least I'm not aware of it, about how hybrid impacts manager leader competency and how it impacts manager leader work. And the reason why is because most managers and leaders justify their existence in face-to-face interactions.
Yep. So very real version of this happened in my community, right? So a guy who really likes my stuff, right, is working at an organization, and they're doing very much a volume play to their sales, and everyone gets a proposal. There is no DQing or qualification structure in place. And he's struggling with some of that because he wants to be consultative. He wants to be a Sherpa, which is our methodology. And he reached out to his boss's boss around something because he knew his boss was in a meeting and he was looking for like a quick thing. And so then he screenshots the interaction between like his boss, right? And he goes, out of curiosity, why did you ask, I think the guy's name is Dan. Why'd you ask Dan about this? And the guy in my community goes, well, because I thought you were on a call and I thought he might have the information. And then he goes, okay, being that I am your direct manager, this stuff all needs to come to me in the future. Okay. And he goes, okay, no offense intended. Right. And he comes into the community and he's like, can you believe this? And I was like, hold on a second. Let's, practice a little bit of empathy here. Let's pretend that you're that manager and you get a ding from your boss. Hey, why is your guy messaging me about this? This is your job. You need to fix it. Now, I'm a big fan of chain of command. I'm prior service, right? Like it has its place. I'm a big fan of that stuff. Process matters. But, he just took it at the first glance. His hot take was, can you believe this guy? And I was like, man, hold on a second though. Like he could be getting his ass chewed by his boss, or maybe he just feels that you're not doing a good job. Like that you should be a little bit more considerate and stuff like that and go to him first, because there's a time and a place for all of that stuff. I remember the first time, I wanted to tell a drill sergeant or, a superior officer or even an NCO, no, because I had a problem with what it was. And the lesson was you do it and then you argue about it later. But right then, in that moment, you take the orders that you're given, kind of situation. And I love the whole, I think it's Eisenhower on his first day in office, right? He just gets inaugurated and someone brings him a sealed envelope. And he's like, why are you bringing me a sealed envelope? I have staff for this. Like, put that in a Slack message, you're going to sound like the worst person on the planet, right? Because there's no tonality included. Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting situation because, you know, I'm a big believer that leaders need to take that extra step and provide some context, provide a little bit of, hey, here's why kind of thing. Not because you should have to explain and validate everything that you possibly should have to do, but because it should be important enough that you're not misheard or misinterpreted, or that you're being taken as just being a hard ass when you're really just trying to make sure that, hey, these are standards and we need to do it this way kind of thing.
And there's so much, well, Nitobe will talk about this in our next little section here, but there's so much loosey-goosiness in organizations, right? Mm-hmm. Mostly driven by politics and political considerations.
Yes, absolutely.
That have little or nothing to do with the actual work being done, and have everything to do with the maintenance of the edifice around the work that's supposed to be getting done, which is work in and of itself. Don't get me wrong, the politics is work, but it's not the work that we ever transparently tell the frontline employee or transparently tell the manager that they are doing. And I would have thought in my younger years that transparency would have already arrived in the year of our Lord 2023. But apparently not. Apparently not. Apparently we have not arrived at a spot where we can all be transparent and talk about what the real thing is that's happening here. And, you know, it's why shows like The Office are still referenced, usually by people younger than me. It's why I think that Office Space is a much better movie than The Office ever was, a television show, but that's another thing. That's another thing altogether. But my point is, those kinds of things exist because those kinds of parodies exist because we can't talk about the bald reality of what's happening at a leadership level, much less a structural level. And I wonder how long it's going to take for us to be able to sort of have that conversation. This is the thing that's really, and the conversation is really, this is the thing that's really happening here, you know, and here's where you fit into the thing that's really happening here. So when Eisenhower said that, Eisenhower was operating out of a spot where he didn't have to tell that person who delivered him the letter what the thing was that was happening. That person already knew because that person was part of a cultural milieu that already reinforced that. We don't live in that cultural milieu anymore. We live in an atomized cultural milieu where no one knows what the deal is, the same way they don't know who their mayor is, the same way they don't know who their governor is, the same way they don't know who the president is. Let's turn the corner here a little bit. Let's get on to the third beat. Back to Way of the Samurai, back to Inazo Nitobe. I'm going to pick up a couple of pages here. And we're going to read a little bit about, a loose business morality. A loose business morality has indeed been the worst blot on our national reputation. But before abusing it or hastily condemning the whole race for it, let us calmly study it, and we shall be rewarded with consolation for the future. Of all the great occupations of life, none was farther removed from the profession of arms than commerce. The merchant was placed lowest in the category of vocations, the knight, the tiller of the soil, the mechanic, the merchant. The samurai derived his income from land and could even indulge, if he had a mind to, in amateur farming, but the counter and abacus were abhorred. We know the wisdom of this social arrangement. Montesquieu has made it clear that the debarring of the nobility from mercantile pursuits was an admirable social policy, in that it prevented wealth from accumulating in the hands of the powerful. The separation of power and riches kept the distribution of the latter more nearly equable. Professor Dill, the author of Roman Society in the Last Century of the Western Empire, has brought afresh to our mind that one cause of the decadence of the Roman Empire was the permission given to the nobility to engage in trade and the consequent monopoly of wealth and power by a minority of the senatorial families. Commerce, therefore, in feudal Japan did not reach that degree of development which it would have attained under freer conditions. The obloquy attached to the calling naturally brought within its pale such as cared little for social repute. Call one a thief and he will steal. Put a stigma on a calling and its followers adjust their morals to it, for it is natural that the quote-unquote normal conscience, as Hugh Black says, quote, rises to the demands made on it and easily falls to the limits of the standard expected from it. And it is unnecessary to add that no business, commercial or otherwise, can be transacted without a code of morals. Our merchants of the feudal period had one among themselves, without which they could never have developed, as they did in embryo, such fundamental mercantile institutions as the guild, the bank, the bourse, insurance, checks, bills of exchange, etc. But in their relations with people outside their vocation, the tradesmen lived too true to the reputation of their order. This being the case, when the country was open to foreign trade, only the most adventurous and unscrupulous rushed to the ports, while the respectable business houses declined for some time the repeated requests of the authorities to establish branch houses. Was Bushido powerless to stay the current of commercial dishonor? Let us see. Those who are well acquainted with our history will remember that only a few years after our treaty ports were open to foreign trade, feudalism was abolished, and when with it the samurai's fiefs were taken and bonds issued to them in compensation, they were given liberty to invest them in mercantile transactions. Now you may ask, why could they not bring their much boasted veracity into their new business relations and so reform the old abuses? Those who had eyes to see could not weep enough. Those who had hearts to feel could not sympathize enough with the fate of many a noble and honest samurai who signally and irrevocably failed in his new and unfamiliar field of trade and industry through sheer lack of shrewdness and coping with his artful plebeian rival. When we know that 80% of the business houses fail in so industrial a country as America, is it any wonder that scarcely one among 100 samurai who went into trade could succeed in his new vocation? It will be long before it will be recognized how many fortunes are wrecked in the attempt to apply Bushido ethics to business models, but it was soon patent to every observing mind that the ways of wealth were not the ways of honor. In what respects were they different? Of the three incentives to veracity that Lecky enumerates vis-a-vis the industrial, the political, and the philosophical, the first was altogether lacking in Bushido. As to the second, it could develop little in a political community under a feudal system. It is in its philosophical and, as Lecky says, in its highest aspect that honesty attained elevated rank in our catalog of virtues. With all my sincere regard for the high commercial integrity of the Anglo-Saxon race, when I ask for the ultimate ground, I am told that honesty is the best policy, that it pays to be honest. Is not this virtue then its own reward? If it is followed because it brings in more cash than falsehood, I am afraid Bushido would rather indulge in lies. This is an interesting section, and the reason I picked it is because John's in sales, and I am in the leadership management space, and we both have worked in businesses and with businesses trying to get them to change processes and procedures and, of course, change their people. I'm also a big fan of ethics, and one of the things that jumps out here is a loose business morality leads to a loose leadership morality. It's interesting how he talks about Bushido as a code of ethics that doesn't actually match the history of Japan, and he ties a code of ethics to history, and then he lays out the historical precedent in a very compact way that I very rarely see writers do. One thing layers upon another, and that's what makes this writing great. All great failings, and we can see this in our current failures in the financial system in the year of our Lord 2023. I'm looking at you, Silicon Valley Bank, and now First Republic, and Credit Suisse, and whoever may come next. All great failings begin with greater ethical and moral failings first. I don't really care about your virtue signaling. I don't really care about your ESG score. I care about what you're actually doing. I don't care about your intentions. I care about your behaviors. However, systems tend to devolve to their lowest level when it no longer pays to operate a process at the highest level, which is why the small things like politeness matter. And committing to the highest level of morality while others are not is the highest form of leadership discipline. Do so consistently leads not only to honor, but also to respect. But I'm not quite sure anymore in our society and culture in the year of our Lord, 2023, if honor and respect pays. Which leads me to my question for John, right? How can leaders develop and maintain a strong leadership morality in the face of unethical behavior? Or frame it another way, when everyone else around you is getting paid for doing wrong, why does it pay to continue to do right?
So I highlighted a lot in this chapter because it was, we did the Book of the Five Rings. And then in addition to that, I was also reading the Musashi, epic, right? Like the Gone with the Wind version and everything, and it talks about how these samurais are paid in rice and land and stuff like that. And I was just kind of like, oh, okay, what an interesting form of commerce. And then I'm reading this and it's talking about how intentional they were around keeping these things separate, right? If you're a samurai, you're not a merchant. And the abacus is to be abhorred, right? What a strong statement. And then I love this thing. Those who had eyes to see could not weep enough. Those who had hearts to feel could not sympathize enough. And with the fate of many a noble and honest samurai who signally and irrevocably failed in his new and unfamiliar field of trade and industry. What a unique situation to be going through, that everyone is excited about opening up and making these changes in the future of our great country and everything. And you have this segment who is probably sounding very much like the get off my lawn kind of people whenever any new change is coming about, and just, stay the course, stay your lane and everything else that happens. And they weren't heard, right? Which is a very interesting thing because I'm a big fan of change that I see valuable, and I'm remarkably rigid around change that I don't see, as something I should be doing. But I love this, that if you're only being honest because it pays, because someone told you that it was the right thing to do to get the business, you're not being honest, right? And I struggle with this idea because as a big networker and I'm out meeting people and stuff, and I'm hearing their stories, and I'm constantly trying to figure out, is this a fabrication? Is this really it? Is there more substance to this? Or are you just putting on a facade? Because if I'm out there networking, one of the hardest things for me to do is to make sure that I'm working with someone and there's good alignment, because people always tell me, John, I'm not a salesperson. That's what you do, but I close deals. Why are you bragging about the outcome when you don't want to wear the label? That drives me crazy, first of all. And you're probably not closing that many deals, because if you were good, you wouldn't be here talking about it. Let's just put that there. But we're both entrepreneurs. We both run businesses. So how much have you had to learn along the way to do this well and stay afloat? And, how many pockets of random crap have you had to go learn and figure out because it wasn't part of your normal track when you were able to just stay in this one little lane and stuff? I have had, call it ego, but I honestly thought it was going to be just hockey stick growth and easy, and I wasn't going to have any concerns, and it was just going to be perfect. No, taxes, payroll, finance, these things matter, right?
I think of the line at the beginning of the poem, "The child roll into the dark tower came," the poem that undergirds Stephen King's Dark Tower series, which I'm a gigantic fan of. Not appropriate for this podcast, but definitely a good piece of fantasy literature. And the first line of that poem is, "My first thought was he lied in every word," and that's how I think of people when they talk about entrepreneurship. You're lying in every word. Or sales, you're lying in every word, because there's no possible way for you to tell me in sales all of the little, as the Joker would say in The Dark Knight, all of the little moments. You can't describe them, right? And I'll frame it very practically. For me, I just abandoned anxiety 3 years ago. I abandoned anxiety about outcomes. I just said, no, that's it, I'm done. Now, saying it intellectually and then going through the whole process emotionally of actually letting all that anxiety about outcomes go it took me 3 years. It's only been this year that I've been able to go, I'm actually genuinely not anxious about that outcome. And actually mean that all the way down to the core.
Everyone talks about like fake it till you make it stuff, right? When you're an entrepreneur and just, you're going to get there and everything. And I think there's a good version of that. And I think there's the bad version of that most people adopt, but just the purposefulness of keeping this fighting class separate from all commerce fascinated me, right? Because I think about my Kung Fu friends, right? And the people who I know who are really great teachers, not a single one of them has got any kind of real business acumen, right? And they don't want it, right? They just want to teach their art. They just want a great school of students who are willing to put in the work, take action, and improve. But how do you get there? You got to go out. You got to do the marketing thing. You got to do the sales thing. You got to be able to talk in a way that gets people excited about the thing that you're doing, and it's hilarious to me because I'm on LinkedIn a lot. I post on LinkedIn a lot. I've got a big network on there. And occasionally, me and another sales nerd, someone else who's attached to revenue and growing sales and everything, will get into like a really great back and forth about, all the psychology that happens in a sales conversation, how to do it the right way. And then inevitably some founder will come along and be like, isn't it just about being honest and having straight conversations? If that was what it was, you wouldn't have a sales team.
Right. Yeah.
You wouldn't need a sales team. You wouldn't be looking for one. We wouldn't have owners putting themselves in terrible spots to get out of the sales seat because they think that they're not enough because they don't have it. And they need someone who's got this innate skill that they don't possess or talent that they don't possess, that they can come in and flip complete no's to complete yeses. What an absurd idea.
Well, it's the idea that, well, I'll frame it this way. We've all been selling since we were born.
Agreed.
Babies sell to their moms. They just do. Otherwise, they're not going to eat.
Yep.
Moms sell to the babies. Now it operates at a much more biological level than maybe a pure, maybe at an aesthetic level. But as you get older, it moves up the ladder of hierarchy to more of an aesthetic level, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're all selling. Like my 6-year-old boy just like ran in here before we started recording today, and he was like doing a whole dance because he's trying to sell me on like wrestling with him after we get done with talking today. Like he's trying to sell me. He's trying to make a sale. He's selling all the time. Just like I teach negotiation. The great line from the Devil's Advocate, are we negotiating? The answer is yes. We're always negotiating.
Always. Yeah.
I'm negotiating with you. You're negotiating with me. We're negotiating with the people who are listening to this podcast. We're negotiating in a larger game across time. This is basic game theory, but we're negotiating in a larger game across time for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, however long this podcast episode is out on the internet, infinity, we're playing a game across infinity. That's really scary for people to think about. And so they have to reduce it down to its smallest parts to be able to contextually manage it. Mm-hmm. And then you have people who, and it's interesting to me how he talks about how Bushido would rather indulge in lies.
Yeah.
Bushido was a concept that was injected into Japanese business management in the 70s and 80s. And Japan's economy collapsed in the 90s. And Japan's birth rate collapsed in the 90s. And Japan is the ultimate example, South Korea is the other one, of the post-industrial society. A society where replacement rates are so far underwater they can't even see the top of the water, where you have robots who take care of the elderly because there just aren't enough people to do it. And your society is demographically at a people level dying on the vine. There's a biblical admonition in the West, in the 10 Commandments. It says, thou shalt not lie. Because lying is fundamental to, well, no, not fundamental. Telling the truth, as far as it is on you to tell the truth, is fundamental to the shaping of reality. And so at scale, we tell ourselves lies all the time. And so it doesn't surprise me that people are lying to themselves about sales. It doesn't surprise me people lying to themselves about leadership. It doesn't surprise me people lying to themselves about Bushido. None of this shocks me
Mm-hmm.
because we build systems around things that seem to be easy, but we don't understand. We actually really don't understand scale as human beings. We really don't.
I would agree with that.
You know, if I see you living in your family in a particular way, it doesn't. I won't say it does. It impacts my family, but how much it impacts my family has to be socially negotiated between the two of us. If I try to scale up the way I raise my family to the nation state level, then I'm an authoritarian.
Yep.
I just am. Just like you, you're an authoritarian. You're going to make authoritarian decisions, and then there's going to be resistance. And it's not going to work. Just like in sales is a microcosm of the nation state. If you try to just say, everybody do sales this way, which by the way, there are sales trainers that say this.
Oh, I know. Very familiar with those.
You know, probably the most damaging sort of sales myth, which again is a totalitarian myth, is in Glengarry Glen Ross. Always be closing. Alec Baldwin running in there, talk about the Glengarry leads, right?
Yeah.
And you laugh, but how much of that totalitarianism are you fighting all the time?
Well, so I have a lot to say on this topic, obviously. One of my, talking about metaphors and trying to force Bushido into like a business management tool and stuff. My number one pet peeve is whenever someone gets a little bit of sales craft knowledge, right? They really understand the psychology of what's happening in the conversation. And the first thing they want to do is they want to use a martial arts metaphor, but they've never trained in martial arts. Oh man, nothing gets my goat more than when I'm scrolling on LinkedIn and some person who's never worn a gi, never stepped on a mat, never put hands with anybody ever is like, oh, I teach verbal Aikido. Have you ever been thrown? Have you ever like gone through the process? Have you ever tried to like throw someone else? Because yeah, there is a bunch of like back and forth, right? And there is a way to kind of talk people out of things and stuff like that. But like, you shouldn't be doing that to talk people into moving into your product, because guess what? They're going to churn. They're going to churn so bad and so quickly when you don't hit those expectations. And I remember when I was learning all this stuff, right, around negative psychology and how to do takeaways and how to do all these like tactics and everything. And I did the same thing, but like I thought that was all I needed. I didn't need anything else and it was going to be okay.
Well, it's the same people who use combat metaphors in leadership. We talked about this back in November when we read About Face and when we read Lawrence of Arabia, and when we read the Civil War memoirs of William Tecumseh Sherman, and my personal favorite Civil War general, Ulysses S. Grant. Who names their kid Ulysses? I love that.
A buddy of mine has got a little boy named Ulysses, and I was like, man, what a great name. It's like a family tradition to have the boys named after you names, right? And I was like, well, you're going to run out of those pretty quickly because I don't know that many.
There's not that many. There's not that many. But one of the ideas that we explored there with my guests and with my co-hosts in those books was this idea that no one who's actually been through war uses a war metaphor to lead anybody.
Oh my! Like whenever Brady came out recently and said that stupid moronic thing about going to go play football is like being deployed. Man, like you were dead to me with the whole ball deflating thing. Well, I have no respect. I don't care that you walked it back because I don't actually believe that you don't believe the statement you said the first time.
His wife left him for a jiu-jitsu player, just not even like a good combat one, just like, or not combat one, but a good competitor one, just like not a Brazilian MMA guy, just like a regular jiu-jitsu guy, a regular jiu-jitsu black belt guy. He's worried about that. That's what he's got going on in his head. He has no idea what just happened.
Yeah. There was a guy, he's pretty well known in the sales space, right? He does a bunch of technical sales and everything. And then a couple of months back, he was like, so really good selling is like verbal Aikido. And I was like, okay, and then I did a little bit of research, a little bit of digging, because I'm like, hey, I don't want to be the asshole who just like, well, I'm the martial arts sales coach, and if I'm doing it, you can, because it's wider than that. I do honestly believe that, and I do think that the art that you train has an impact on how you think about the sales metaphor and how all this stuff like attaches, right? I'm sure that if we tried to equate like your first art and the learnings and the philosophy of that to my first art and the learnings and philosophy of that, and how that would impact how we would think about a sales function, it would like a lot of it would probably align, but there's probably going to be some big differences there, and that's okay. Right. So I'm not trying to say that I'm the only person who's allowed to like compare and analyze how martial arts is like sales. That's not what I'm saying. If you've not done it though, don't. Right. Like don't make it your thing, because you don't even know what you're talking about, honestly. Right. It's great that you saw a YouTube video where someone was like, now watch me use their own strength against them. But man, until like, it's different once you experience it in the lightness of it, right? Because what happens is everyone just overdoes it, is really kind of what it boils down to. You know this, I know this, but you know, it's just my number one pet peeve, and like I see it every time I see it, you know. But every martial art instructor I know doesn't want to be a salesperson. Right. So I'm kind of interested in like, was that like a conscious decision to keep the samurai away from commerce, or was it, or were they just so focused on this one path that they were like, money, I'm focused on the sword kind of deal?
So I came out of, maybe this will give me some insight into this. I'll take a couple of moments, address this a little bit from a different kind of angle. So I came out of the fine arts area, right? And when I came out of college, I had this grand idea that I was going to go into fine arts management. That's a whole field of dealing with gallery owners and curators and artists and acting as a middleman between all of them. Because quite frankly, Pablo Picasso, actually, I won't even use Picasso. I use Picasso a lot. I won't pick up Picasso today. Salvador Dali doesn't really want to talk to a gallery owner. At all. And he just wants to go off and be Salvador Dali. Right. Gerhard Richter doesn't really want to do a deal with a museum in Germany. He just wants to go off and cut up another shark and put it under glass or whatever he's doing, right? Or was doing. Whoever it is that's making art that you've never heard of in some graphic design program in some state college right now, in 4 years or 5 years, or God help them, 6 to 10 years, when they get out of that program, they don't want to really go deal with a gallery owner in some podunk area to try to sell 3 pieces of art at $2,500 a piece so they can make their rent. So they can continue to live in New York City, because New York City is expensive if you're an artist. So arts management exists as sort of the middleman. It's like kind of like agents, right? Yeah, it's like just like music management. Yeah, it's the same thing, right? The same thing, right? And the psychology of artists is the same as the psychology of, I think, the psychology of martial arts studio owners. It's the same kind of psychology. I agree. And they're doing their art. They care about their art. And all of these other things are distractions from the thing they care about. And unfortunately, what they don't understand is, and I'm kind of working through this actually with I'm kind of working through this with some people locally, without getting into too many details about that. But you know, the thing that you have to tell them is that if you don't get the pieces in place, just like you would tell an artist, if you don't get the pieces in place, you're not going to be able to do more of your thing that you care about. You're actually going to wind up doing less, because you're going to wind up chasing all these other things that you don't have optimized to work perfectly, or at least to work better than what they would work if you just either A, didn't do anything with them at all, or B, were in them all the time and exhausted, and now you can't go on the mat, right? And now you can't teach the Aikido, or you can't teach the form, or you can't teach the kata, or you can't teach the kick, right? Which is the thing you really care about. And it's interesting, martial arts folks are kind of a weird combination of jock, and you mentioned nerd, but jock and artist. I wouldn't necessarily say nerd, but jock and artist. So they're creative and open, but they're also highly conscientious and duty driven. So it's all this psychology that comes together. Does that make for good business owners and entrepreneurs? Sometimes, but they have to get aligned in the appropriate direction. And if there's no one around them to help them with that alignment piece, then they struggle. They struggle massively. Yeah,
Man, I did a big project with like a music marketing group, and it was all these people. I learned a lot about music marketing and why they all have agents. And you don't really want someone who is in charge of the artful creative direction of this thing.
Mhm.
Also the person asking for money, right?
Mhm.
Like it's kind of a flawed situation, because otherwise, like, let's just put this in the context that I think about it the most, right? If you're out there to make art, you're hopefully making art for yourself because it speaks to you, right? Now, some people will say, well, you sold out because you're just making art that's going to sell, whatever. And I think there's a time and a place for that, because once again, if you're not bringing in revenue, you're going to have to go get a job, and you don't get to be an artist at all,
Right.
And one of my favorite rappers, Logic, talks about how much easier his life is now that he has a team, right?
Mhm.
So he has a manager, he's got people that can help with like samples and clearances and all this stuff, because like it's a lot to manage.
Mhm.
There's a reason why this stuff is hard, and my thing is, I love coaching those kinds of people, right? Because I can show them that, like, hey, no one is going to be able to sell this until
Right.
you're able to sell it. Right?
Right.
Until you can navigate these conversations and the value and like, how does this value match to the thing that you do? If you can't do that, you have to hire someone like me to come in and do this, right? Because I always use this kind of very short story about chefs and cooks,
Mhm.
right? And once the restaurant is up and running and everything, and you have the menu and you've got a great following and everything, cool. You just need to like make sure you've got great cooks. But if you're opening a restaurant, you need a chef.
Yep.
And the skill set is different, right? Has to be. So,
well, the people who figure that out are the people like the Jerry Seinfelds or the Jay-Z's, the names, right?
Mhm.
Andy Warhol's, right? Or even, I mean, we just mentioned Brady, who figured out that the thing I do, if I want to do more of that, I need structure around me to do more of that. And the people who never get it are still, trying to sell out the Holiday Inn in Dubuque, Iowa.
Yep.
And I wish it were easier than that. And I wish the samurai had understood that. But again, to his point, people confuse shrewdness with good management. And they confuse good management with shrewdness. That's an old line from Harry Lime from The Third Man. And it's true. It's absolutely the truth. And so there's just as much artistic integrity in business as there is in the art of the samurai.
Agreed.
If you do it correctly.
Yeah, very fair additional caveat. My first business partner, he went to school at Parsons in New York, right? Like the big art school up there. And man, he loves art. And so we were hanging out one day, and I was like, hey man, why aren't you using the art stuff? Like, you were good at it. You really, really enjoyed it. Like, why aren't you an artist? And he's like, business is now my creative outlet.
There you go.
And that was really the first time, like, I can point to a handful of conversations with that business partner that like just dramatically turned my world upside down, right? The first one was sales is like Kung Fu. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, sales is just something I do because it pays for Kung Fu. And he was like, doesn't have to be that way. And that, okay, cool. Now I want it. But it's those little bitty things, but I now think about it the same way, right? I've always kind of felt like I wasn't a really creative person because my grandmother was an artist. My brother's a musician. He can make music with anything. And I'm just like this like guy who likes charts and graphs and linear functions and everything else like this, but like didn't go to school to be a developer, some in this weird space. Well, now like the ability to craft a story, the ability to write a book, the ability to put out content that speaks to an audience and everything is a creative endeavor. And if I had just kind of continued to like not lean into that, man, that would be brutal in my opinion. Like I wouldn't be here as an entrepreneur. I wouldn't be here having created a sales brand and written a sales book and everything if I'm not kind of clued into the idea that like art has got many different directions and most of them are okay as long as you can continue to like keep the bills paid and keep the lights on and do the things you need to do.
That's right. And that's basically what Seth Godin says. We already referenced him earlier, but one of the big principles that I always got from him was you need to do enough during the day so that you can earn enough money to continue to play the game tomorrow.
Yep.
And if you just keep doing that, then you win.
Yep.
That's the win, right? And the win is not I'm going to come up with this great idea on a napkin. Someone's going to give me $1 million and I'm going to be Jeff Bezos tomorrow. That's not the
Yep.
win.
That's not the
That's
win.
not, that might be Jeff Bezos's win, but that's not your win. Your win is going to look like, well, whatever your win looks like. And so you have to do enough to play tomorrow. And I have always kept that when I talk about, getting rid of or letting go of anxiety, in the last, like 3 years ago, and then like having the actual, like, okay, now it's actually gone kind of thing. That's part of being able to play the game, because what I realized is the cash in the bank account is not the place where I have to have the dollar to play tomorrow. It has to be in the mental or the emotional bank account. That's where I have to have it to be able to play tomorrow. And issues of scale, issues of shrewdness, issues of good management, issues of process, issues of people, all of these kinds of things. If I don't have that first thing done, again, it's putting the things in the appropriate order. I'm a big fan of putting things in the appropriate order. If you don't put it in the appropriate order, it doesn't happen. Which, to the point here you're making about martial arts, I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about jiu-jitsu is, you have to put things in order first before you can even begin to even consider competency. And one of the big things at white belt is survival. And then at blue belt, you can start thinking about, okay, how do I put things together? And then at purple belt, you can start thinking about, okay, now I'm a little bit dangerous. Now I can start doing some things. At brown belt, you can start thinking about what type of naproxen or aspirin you're going to take every night. And then at black belt, you're not thinking about your black belt. And that's that's great to me, because that's the ultimate. I don't really care what I think about this thing, but I really don't care about what you think about this thing.
Man,
both egos are just drained from the whole thing, but it takes 10 years.
Yeah.
It takes you 10 years to get to that point of ego draining. And I love that. I love that idea.
So when a long time ago, I don't know if we talked about this last time, I was a professional poker player, right? So all of my income came from playing cards, and dealing in a poker room, right? It was underground here in Fort Worth. And one of the things that I took away from my poker coach was, like, what battle are you fighting, right? Like, are you willing to go broke to win this hand? If so, why? Like what does that mean? And are you trying to win the hand? Are you trying to win the day? Or are you trying to keep playing? Is how he would always kind of like ask me about it. And now, that was a long time ago, obviously. And a friend of mine is still a professional poker player. He has a World Series poker bracelet. He has a couple of rings, and he just always tells people, don't go broke, because if you're not broke, you can continue on this path. And there's going to be some bad days. There's going to be some bad weeks. Luck and variance, these things happen, right? 95% sounds amazing until you're on the other 5% of it, right? And even still, like, I know people that have lost half a million dollars because someone had a 5% shot to win 2 cards and one of them hits, so there is still like a luck element. So I think about that all the time, right? Because especially as like an entrepreneur, like when you're new and you're starting out and you don't really know who you're going to be when you grow up and everything, you got to make it through. And someone reached out to me recently because they tried to go out on their own. It didn't really work. They're concerned about the burn rate, so they're going back to work. And I was like, cool, man, you have forever to go out and do this thing on your own. Don't put yourself in a terrible spot because your ego is telling you that you have to do this thing right now.
Love that you mentioned ego, because that's a good turn into our last section here. I want to talk a little bit about the sources of Bushido. It's how ego can turn you upside down if you're not paying attention in these fractured times. Back to The Way of the Samurai by Inazo Nitobe. Chapter 2, sources of Bushido. We're going to read a couple of different selections in here, because there's an overall point that I want to make. I may begin with Buddhism. It furnished a sense of calm, trust in fate, a quiet submission to the inevitable, that stoic composure in sight of danger or calamity, that disdain of life and friendliness with death. A foremost teacher of swordsmanship, when he saw his pupil master the utmost of his art, told him, beyond this, my instruction must give way to Zen teaching. Zen is the Japanese equivalent for the dhyana, which represents human effort to reach through meditation zones of thought beyond the range of verbal expression. Its method is contemplation, and its purport, as far as I understand it, to be convinced of a principle that underlies all phenomena, and if it can, of the absolute itself, and thus to put oneself in harmony with this absolute. Thus defined, the teaching was more than the dogma of a sect, and whoever attains to the perception of the absolute raises himself above mundane things and awakes to a new heaven and a new earth. What Buddhism failed to give, Shintoism offered in abundance. Such loyalty to the sovereign, such reverence for ancestral memory, and such filial piety are not taught by any other creed, were inculcated by the Shinto doctrines, imparting passivity to the otherwise arrogant character of the samurai. Shinto theology has no place for the dogma of original sin. On the contrary, it believes in the innate goodness and godlike purity of the human soul, adoring it as the adytum from which the divine oracles are proclaimed. Everybody has observed that Shinto's shrines are conspicuously devoid of objects and instruments of worship, and that a plain mirror hung in the sanctuary forms the essential part of its furnishings. The presence of this article is easy to explain. It typifies the human heart, which, when perfectly placid and clear, reflects the very image of the deity. When you stand, therefore, in front of the shrine to worship, you see your own image reflected on its shining surface, and the act of worship is tantamount to the old Delphic injunction, know thyself. But self-knowledge does not imply, either in the Greek or Japanese teaching, knowledge of the physical part of man, not his anatomy or his psychophysics. Knowledge was to be of a moral kind, the introspection of our moral nature. Mommsen, comparing the Greek and the Roman, says that when the former worshipped, he raised his eyes to heaven, for his prayer was contemplation, while the latter veiled his head, for his was reflection. Essentially, like the Roman conception of religion, our reflection brought into prominence not so much the moral as the national consciousness of the individual. Its nature worship endeared the country to our inmost souls, while its ancestor worship, tracing from lineage to lineage, made the imperial family the fountainhead of the whole nation. To us, the country is more than land and soil from which to mine gold or to reap grain. It is the sacred abode of the gods, the spirits of our forefathers. To us, the emperor is more than the arch-constable of a Rakstat, or even the patron of a Kulturstat. He is the bodily representative of heaven on earth, blending in his person its power and its mercy. If what M. Butumi says is true of English royalty, that it is not only the image of authority, but the author and symbol of national unity, as I believe it to be, doubly and trebly may this be affirmed of royalty in Japan. The tenets of Shintoism cover the two predominating features of the emotional life of our race, patriotism and loyalty. Arthur May Knapp very truly says, quote, in Hebrew literature, it is often difficult to tell whether the writer is speaking of God or the Commonwealth, of heaven or of Jerusalem, of the Messiah or of the nation itself. A similar confusion may be noticed in the nomenclature of our national faith. I said confusion because it will be so deemed by a logical intellect on account of its verbal ambiguity, still being a framework of national instinct and race feelings. Shintoism never pretends to be a systemic philosophy or irrational theology. This religion, or is it more correct to say the race emotions which this religion expressed, thoroughly imbued Bushido with loyalty to the sovereign and love of country. These act in more as impulses than as doctrines, for Shintoism, unlike the medieval Christian church, prescribed to its votaries scarcely any credenda, furnishing them at the same time with an agenda of a straightforward and simple type. As to strictly ethical doctrines, the teaching of Confucius were the most prolific source of Bushido. His enunciation of the 5 moral relations between master and servant, the governing and the governed, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger brother, and between friend and friend was but a confirmation of what the race instinct had recognized before his writings were introduced from China. The writings of Confucius and Mencius formed the principal textbooks for youths and the highest authority in discussion among the old. A mere acquaintance with the classics of these two sages was held, however, in no high esteem. A common proverb ridicules one who has only an intellectual knowledge of Confucius as a man ever studious but ignorant of Analects. A typical samurai calls a literary savant a book-smelling sot. Another compares learning to an ill-smelling vegetable that must be boiled and boiled before it is fit for use. A man who has read a little smells a little pedantic, and a man who has read much smells yet more so. Both are alike unpleasant. The writer meant thereby that knowledge becomes really such only when it is assimilated in the mind of the learner and shows in his character. Bushido made light of knowledge as such. It was not pursued as an end in itself, but as a means to the attainment of wisdom. Hence, he who stopped short of this end was regarded no higher than a convenient machine, which could turn out poems and maxims at bidding. Thus, knowledge was conceived as identical with its practical application in life, and this Socratic doctrine found its greatest exponent in the Chinese philosopher Wan Yang Ming, who never wearies of repeating, "To know and to act are one and the same." Now I'm going to skip forward a little bit, and I'm going to bring this up. Thus, whatever the sources, the essential principles which Bushido imbibed from them and assimilated to itself were few and simple. Few and simple as these were, they were sufficient to furnish a safe conduct of life, even through the unsafest days of the most unsettled period of our nation's history. The wholesome, unsophisticated nature of our warrior ancestors derived ample food for their spirit from a sheaf of commonplace and fragmentary teachings, gleaned, as it were, on the highways and byways of ancient thought, and stimulated by the demands of the age, formed from these gleamings a new and unique type of manhood. An acute French savant, M. de la Mazelière, thus sums up his impressions of the 16th century. Quote, "For the middle of the 16th century, all is confusion in Japan, in the government, in society, in the church. But the civil wars, the manners returning to barbarism, the necessity for each to execute justice for himself, these formed men comparable to those Italians of the 16th century, in whom Taine praises the vigorous initiative, the habit of sudden resolutions and desperate undertakings, the grand capacity to do and to suffer. In Japan, as in Italy, the rude manners of the Middle Ages made of man a superb animal, wholly militant and wholly resistant." And this is why the 16th century displays in the highest degree the principal quality of the Japanese race, that great diversity which one finds there between minds as well as between temperaments. While in India and even in China, men seem to differ chiefly in degree of energy or intelligence. In Japan, they differ by originality of character as well. Wholly militant and wholly resistant. I'm going to circle back to politeness. We're going to close the loop here with John. This rudeness that we're experiencing right now in our culture really bugs me. And the technology and the communication patterns of the people of the early 21st century, particularly in the United States, have created leaders, or at least have given space to leaders who are wholly militant and wholly resistant, mostly for the sake of clicks in our time and hot takes. But if you're not contextual enough, or if you're not wise enough to pick up on that, you're not going to know. You're going to fall for the trick. 2020 was an interesting year. There was a lot of genuine panic, but there was also this idea of pedal panicking, which comes from the real estate business, where you move somebody into a neighborhood, or you're as a real estate agent walk into a neighborhood and you tell everybody, hey, those people over there or these people over here are getting ready to move into the neighborhood. You might want to sell your house. And then you cause a bank run or a real estate run. And yes, real estate agents have actually done that in the past. There's a lot of panic peddling that went on in 2020. And that has created an environment where rudeness is now our highest virtue. But there is hope. This is why I do the podcast. There is hope for those who want to grow in character, who want to abandon the ego, and who want to become intentional and competent in the work of leading without descending into the brutal in the short term. I will admit I do have a Hobbesian view of man, but it's tempered by optimism. I do think we can be better, because there's been times in history when we have been better, but it's hard. And the ego would rather do the lazy thing and be wholly militant and wholly resistant, particularly when it's easy to get a click. John, how do we stay on the path? How do we lead in these fractured times? How do we lead without being militant and resistant? How do we incorporate the way of the samurai into what we do in our daily lives as leaders?
I really liked, and I highlighted that kind of last section that you were reading about, where they're talking about someone who reads too many books is just a sot, right? And it speaks to this idea, and I see this in entrepreneurial groups where like someone is like, "Hey, I read 75 books last year," and then like some person who didn't read one is like, "But how many have you implemented?" Okay, well, at least they're like trying, and
Right.
and I see this as a big reader and also someone who tries to like implement things that I think I can use in my business and in my coaching. I think the other side of this thing was that
Lex Friedman gets a bad rap.
why does he get a bad rap?
Well, he tweeted out something, oh gosh, like at the beginning of this year about reading like, I don't know, 20 books in a year, and he tweeted out like heavy duty books, and then Nicholas Nassim Taleb came for him. And I was like, why? Just why?
Yeah.
The man's trying something.
Yeah.
And I like Nicholas Nassim Taleb. I really do. I like all three. I have all of his books. I enjoy his thinking about fractals. But come on, dude. Like, I understand you're in a corner of a room in Lebanon somewhere. Like, I get it. You're better than all of us, but come on.
I think that the answer to the big question that we've been talking about here is a chapter we've not talked about in the book, and it's the self-control chapter, right? Because from the outside of this, the samurais are pictured as these like the Jockos of yore, if that makes sense, right? Like what I'm talking about. I've met Jocko, and he's a very, very interesting guy. Like, lives what he preaches. It's amazing. He's always talking about self-control and being disciplined and doing these things. And in this chapter, there's a couple of things in here that like highlighted and have just like been standing out to me, like since reading this thing. And I think it really comes down to this. One of the things that I highlighted was calmness of behavior, composure of mind should not be disturbed by passion of any kind.
Ooh, yes.
Right. So
yes.
Let's look at what that means, right? Someone goes around you and you're mad about it because it's your guy, should have come to you first. Why are you so riled up? You're riled up out of fear, right? You're fearful you're going to lose your job, or you look like you're not doing something. So you're just going to take it out on someone. That's ridiculous, right? Handle your stuff. You shouldn't be that concerned about it. I highlighted that. On the other side of it, I highlighted this other passage that I thought was very interesting. Discipline and self-control can easily go too far. It can well repress the genial current of the soul. It can force pliant natures into distortions and monstrosities. It can beget bigotry, breed hypocrisy, and habitate affections. Be a virtue never so noble. Right? And I think we're talking about polar ends of this thing. Right? Yep. You've got people that are rankled every time everything doesn't go their way, and then you have people who are making such a big deal about how so disciplined that they are, that they're like living kind of like monks, and there's a whole lot of room in the middle. But I think the thing to really be thoughtful about is the self-control to not post the hot take, right? The self-control to not send that email when you're fired up about it because you're ramped up. And poker players do an amazing job of realizing tilt, right? Tilt is emotional thinking that causes you to take subpar actions, right? And when you're fired up about an email and you're going to fire it off to someone, yeah, you're tilted, right? If you get off of a call where someone has ghosted you and you're like, you know what, I'm not taking no from this next person no matter what, that's tilted thinking, right? You are not under control in those moments. And you and I know this as martial artists, right? If all these guys were like, man, when I'm mad, I just see red. Cool. You're going to lose. You're going to get destroyed by the person who has presence of mind because they've been here before. They've normalized this whole thing and they have a game and a program and you're just out here winging it. They're going to destroy you, right? It's that self-control that I think that people are missing, right? And it's easy to thrive in because of the anonymity of some of these like platforms and social things. But I just think that most people don't have enough self-control, right? Yeah. And I think that the people who do, like, I love Jocko. I like his book. I mean, his book is a top shelf book to me, which means that I recommend it to people like as often as I possibly can. I've met him, super solid guy. But I saw this tweet and like I laugh about it every time I think about this. If the only thing you're known for is getting up at 4:30 in the morning, you probably need to be doing something else.
Yeah.
Right. like he's probably had some amazing outcomes with the people that he's coached, and I'm sure his book has had some amazing impacts on people. He's got thriving businesses and everything, but still the only thing that people talk about with him is that he gets up at 4:30 and he does jujitsu and he lifts weights and he surfs, and that's it. Like no one talks about the other parts of this thing, because the only thing that people are like latched onto is the discipline that he talks about, right?
Yep.
And you know, when you're on a path, I firmly believe that if you want to be great in something, it's about the trade-offs you're willing to make on that path to greatness. So yeah, you're going to get up at 4:30. No one cares though. Yeah, you're going to go and you're going to, if you're on a martial arts path, you're going to get hit, you're going to get hurt. It's going to suck occasionally, right? And people aren't going to get it. That's your thing. You shouldn't be trying to sell the virtue of your martial arts path to people who don't care about martial arts. Just talk about like it's just a way of life for you. Because that's kind of the place that I got to, because for a long time, I love martial arts. God, I like the impact it's had on my life as far as becoming a better human. I can't even begin to talk about it, right? I mean, every aspect of my life has been changed because of that path. And I talk about it a lot in my coaching and my content and everything. And I know that it's not for everybody, but I also know if you've done something, you have a similar path to my martial arts path. Like if you've been a musician, cool. You know what? You've not gotten hit and punched, but you've had to grind it out in front of crowds who didn't know who you were. I respect that. Right?
Yep.
Comedians who will get up and bomb on purpose because they've got some new material that they're dying to try out, but everyone just wants the old stuff. I respect that. And these people aren't walking around making big deals about it. This is just part of the path of improvement. So I think that self-control thing, it's just, most people don't need a megaphone, and all social media is a megaphone is how I think about it. So it's just easy to hang in the crowd, right? You got miles of separation. I'm going to say whatever I want. It's going to be great, and then you can't understand why people are mad at you in person whenever you make the same kind of comments, because they're crappy comments. They didn't need to be said. I game with all these kids, right? They're people I don't know, right? And some of the voices, like you have to be a kid to have a voice like that. It's just how it works.
Oh yeah.
And
yeah,
I'm old and I'm not super good at this game. And I'll have people be like, bro, like, no offense, but you're terrible about this. Cool. We're in the same game, man. Like in the same league at the same level and everything. But, so maybe not needing to be said kind of deal. And it just baffles me how they just, no offense, if I'm being honest.
Self-control is, and I highlighted the same pieces that you highlighted in that self-control chapter. And if we had more time today, that was actually going to be like a little bit more that I was going to talk about, because I thought that was some real juice in there.
And it's a short chapter too. It's one of the shortest ones in the book. And it probably should have been first. Probably.
Yeah. Well,
right.
The man was operating in a different kind. He was doing a different kind of thing. He was
trying to
thing.
Yeah. He's not trying to turn people to that way of thinking. No. He's trying to show this isn't that different than what you've been through, he does a masterful job of that, right? If he didn't bring in all those worldly references and compare it in the way that he does, this book would be easy to ignore. Mm-hmm. But like, if you choose to ignore it now, I think it's at your own peril.
I'd like to thank John Hill, aka Small Mountain, for coming on the podcast yet again today. Always a good conversation. I could talk to this guy for hours.
Same. Please keep picking cool like martial arts books, and I'm down to be your sparring partner over any of them, my friend. Awesome. This is awesome.
Awesome. Yeah. We try to do at least one a year, sometimes two. Want to really get some information in there. I do want to go back and I want to recover Sun Tzu. I don't really like how that episode came together. I want to really
go back and
cover Art of War again. Because there's some things in there that I'd really like to bounce off of another fellow devotee of the martial game, and examine the tactics and practices that Sun Tzu talks about in a different kind of way. As we close, I will say this: Self-control is key to staying on the path, but so is patience and veracity and courage. So is understanding the role of women and the understanding of how we fit into society with our families and with our friends and with our intimate partners, and all the way up and all the way down. There's an issue of scale, right? What's good for me may not be good for you, and what's good for you may not be good for me, but collectively we can democratically, this is the dream, find a way that is good for everybody by groping our way forward. And this is what Inazo Nitobe believed in. He had his entire life and his entire career doing a fascinating period of time in Japanese and in world history when that groping felt like groping in the dark, felt desperate. Matches our own time, right? Look, we may have a third world war or we may not. We may have more economic strife or we may not. We may have natural disasters that rip apart our country or we may not. We may have riots or insurrections or we may not. But one thing that it does remain, we will always need leaders. We will need leaders who have not necessarily the code of Bushido, but who have a moral compass and an ethical focus, who on purpose choose to behave in certain ways and then follow through in those ways, regardless of what the clearing at the end of the path might be. Once again, I want to thank my guest co-host today for this episode, John Hill. And with that, I'm out. Listen and subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all the major podcast players that you listen to podcasts on, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and even Spotify. And please leave a 5-star review if you like the show. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to make sure that this show gets into the ears of the leaders who need to hear it. And of course, tell all your friends. If you want to get started on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing's products and services can help your team do that. Check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We also have a video-based subscription service, that's software as a service, that can help your team become better at the individual level. 60 modules and over 100 hours of video and written content for you at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com. We've also got books that will help you and your team grow. Pick up a copy today of My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 Essays on Disrupting Your Workplace by Disrupting Your Boss, and subscribe to the Little Red podcast I launched earlier this year with the same name as that Little Red book. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership, co-written with contributions from Bradley Madigan. This is the book for right now that was written for leaders right now. Pick up a copy by heading over to 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. That's 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. You pay for shipping, and you'll get a copy of my second book as well. Finally, you can get all these books in paperback, hardcover, or as ebooks on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place online you order books. Finally, HSCT Publishing is on YouTube. Like and subscribe to the video version of the Leadership Lessons for the Great Books podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing and hit the subscribe button. You'll get our weekly video updates, which is the video version of this podcast. And, of course, you're going to want to subscribe to my other podcast. That's right, I do more than one. The Jesan Sorrells Presents audio experience, where I talk more casually with a broader range of people about all matters that matter in the world today, from arts all the way to analytics. All right, that's it for me.